ladies and gentlemen, students and scholars, teachers and trainers, professors and professionals, and listeners and learners. Those who belong to the field of English language, literature and grammar, I, Dr. Rakesh from USA, heartily, cordially welcome all of you. Dear friends, today we are going through the Puritan age from 1620 to 1660. How this is brought revolutionary and visionary change in the form of literary characteristics. You are listening. In literature also, the Puritan age was one of confusion due to the breaking up of old ideals. Medieval standards of chivalry, the impossible loves and romance of which Spencer furnished the types, perished no less surely than the ideal of a national church, and in the absence of any fixed standard of literary criticism, there was nothing to prevent the exaggeration of the metaphysical poets, who are the literary parallels to religious sects like the Anabaptists. Poetry took new and startling forms in Donne and Hubbard, and prose became as somber as Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy. The spiritual gloom which sooner or later fastens upon all the writers of this age, and which is unjustly attributed to Puritan influence, is due to the breaking up of accepted standards in government and religion. No people, from the Greeks to those of our own, they have suffered the loss of old ideals without causing its writers to cry, Ichabod, the glory has departed. That is the unconscious tendency of literary men in old times, who look forward for their golden age, and it need not concern the student of literature, who even in the breakup of cherished institutions looks for some foray glimpse of a better light which is to break upon the world. This so-called gloomy age produced some minor poems of exquisite workmanship, and one great master of verse whose work would glorify and any age or people, John Milton, in whom the indomitable Puritan spirit finds its noblest expression, There are three main characteristics in which Puritan literature differs from that of the preceding age. One is Elizabethan literature, with all its diversity, had a marked unity in spirit, resulting from the patriotism of all classes and their devotion to a queen who, with all her faults, sought first the nation's welfare. Under these thoughts, all this was changed. The kings were the open enemies of the people. The country was divided by the struggle for political and religious liberty, and the literature was as divided in spirit as were the struggling parties. Next, number two is Elizabethan literature is generally inspiring. It throbs with youth and hope and vitality. That which followed speaks of age and sadness. Even its brightest hours are followed by gloom and by the pessimism inseparable from the passing of old standards. Next, number three is Elizabethan literature is intensely romantic. The romance springs from the heart of youth and believes all things, even the impossible. The great schoolman's credo, I believe because it is impossible, is a better expression of Elizabethan literature than of medieval theology. In the literature of the Puritan period, one looks in vain for romantic ardor. Even in the lyrics and love poems, a critical, intellectual spirit takes its place, and whatever romance asserts itself is in form rather than in feeling. A fantastic and artificial adornment of speech rather than the natural utterance of a heart in which sentiment is so strong and true that poetry is only expression. Literature of the Puritan period, the transition poets, when one attempts to classify the literature of the first half of the 17th century from the death of Elizabeth 1603 to the Restoration 1660, he realizes the impossibility of grouping poets by any accurate standard. The classifications attempted here have small dependence upon dates or sovereigns and are suggestive rather than accurate. Thus, Shakespeare and Bacon wrote largely in the region of James I, but their work in Elizabethan in spirit, and Bunyan is no less a Puritan because he happened to write after the Restoration. The name metaphysical poets given by Dr. Johnson is somewhat suggestive but not descriptive of the followers of Donne. The name Caroline or Cavalier poets brings to mind the careless temper of the royalists who followed King Charles with a devotion of which he was unworthy, and the name Spenserian poets recalls the title band of dreamers who clung to Spenser's ideals, even while his romantic medieval castles was battered down by science at the one gate and Puritanism at the other. At the beginning of this bewildering confusion of ideals expressed in literature, we note a few writers who are generally known as Jacobean poets, but whom we have called the transition poets because with the later dramatists they saw clearly the changing standards of the age. The metaphysical poets, this name was given by Dr. Johnson in Darrison because of the fantastic form of Donne's poetry is often applied to all minor poets of the Puritan age. We use the term here in a narrow sense, excluding the followers of Daniel and that later group known as the Cavalier poets. It includes Donne, Herbert, Weller, Denham, Cowley, Wagon, Devrent, Marvell, and Grasha. The advanced student finds them all worthy of study, not only for their occasional excellent poetry, but because of their influence on later literature. John Donne, who born in 1573 and died in 1631, the briefest outline of Donne's life shows its intense human interest. He was born in London, the son of a rich iron merchant at the time when the merchants of England were creating a new and higher kind of princes. On his father's side, he came from an old Welsh family, and on his mother's side from the Awoods and Sir Thomas More's family. Both families were Catholic, and in his early life, persecution was brought near, for his brother died in prison for harboring a proscribed priest, and his own education could not be continued in Oxford and Cambridge because of his religion. Such an experience generally sets a man's religious standard for life, but presently Donne, as he studied law at Lincoln's Inn, was investigating the philosophic grounds of all faith. Gradually, he left the church in which he was born, renounced all dominations, and called himself simply Christian. Meanwhile, he wrote poetry and shared his wealth with needy Catholic relatives. He joined the expedition of Essex for Cadiz in 1596 and for the Azores in 1597, and on sea and in the camp found time to write poetry. Two of his best poems, The Storm and the Calm, belong to this period. Next, he traveled in Europe for 3 years, but occupied himself with study and poetry. Returning home, he became secretary to Lord Egerton, fell in love with the latter's young niece, Annie Moore, and married her, for which cause Donne was cast into prison. Strangely enough, his poetical work at this time is not a song of youthful romance, but the progress of the soul, a study of transmigration. Years of wandering and poverty followed until Sir George Moore forgave the young lovers and made an allowance to his daughter. Instead of enjoying his new comforts, Donne grew more ascetic and intellectual. In his taste, he refused also the flattering offer of the entering the Church of England and of receiving a comfortable living. By his pseudo-martyr, he attracted the favor of James I, who persuaded him to be ordained, yet left him without any place or employment. When his wife died, her allowance ceased, and Dunn was left with 7 children in extreme poverty. Then he became a preacher, rose rapidly by sheer intellectual force and genius, and in 4 years was the greatest of English preachers and Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. There he carried some to heaven in holy raptures and led others to amend their lives. And as he leans over the pulpit with intense earnestness is likened by Isaac Walton to an angel leaning from a cloud. There is variety enough to epitomize his age, and yet in all his life, stronger than any impression of outward will or woe, is the sense of mystery that surrounds Donne. In all his work, one finds a mystery, a hiding of some deep thing which the world would gladly know and share, and which is suggested in his haunting little poem, The Undertaking. I have done one braver thing than all the worthies did, and yet a braver thence doth spring, which is to keep that height. Donne's poetry, Donne's poetry is so uneven, at times so startling and fantastic, that few critics would care to recommend it to others. Only a few will read his works, and they must be left to their own browsing to find what pleases them, like deer which, in the midst of plenty, take a bite here and there and wander on, tasting 20 varieties of food in as arch feeding. One who reads much will probably be well. Donne's lack of any consistent style or literary standard. For instance, Chaucer and Milton are as different as two poets could well be, yet the work of each is marked by a distinct and consistent style, and it is the style as much as the matter which makes the tales or the Paradise Lost a work for all time. Donne threw style and all literary standards to the winds, and precisely for this reason he is forgotten, though his great intellect and his genius had marked him as one of those who should do things worthy to be remembered. While the tendency of literature is to exalt style at the expense of thought, the world has many men and women who exalt feelings and thought above expression, and to these Donne is good reading. Browning is of the same school and compels attention. While Donne played havoc with Elizabethan style, he nevertheless influenced our literature in the way of boldness and originality, and the present tendency is to give him a larger place nearer to the few great poets than he has occupied since Ben Jonson declared that he was the first poet of the world in some things, but likely to perish for not being understood. For too much of his poetry we must apply his own satiric verses on another crudities. Infinite work, infinite work which doth so far extend that none can study it to any end. Shakespeare, John Milton, who born in 1608 and died in 1674, from Wordsworth's sonnet on Milton. Thy soul was like a star and dwelt apart, thou hadst a voice whose sound was like the sea, pure as the naked heavens, majestic, free. So didst thou travel on life's common way in cheerful godliness, and yet thy heart the loveliest duties on herself did lay. Shakespeare and Milton are the two figures that tower conspicuously above the goodly fellowship of men who have made our literature famous. Each is representative of the age that produced him, and together they form a suggestive commentary upon the two forces that rule our humanity, the force of impulse and the force of a fixed purpose. Shakespeare is the poet of impulse, of the loves, hates, fears, jealousies and ambitions that swayed the men of his age. Milton is the poet of steadfast will and purpose, who moves like a god amid the fears and hopes and changing impulses of the world, regarding them as trivial and momentary things that can never steer a great soul from its course. It is well to have some comparison in mind while studying the literature of the Elizabethan and the Puritan age. While Shakespeare and Ben Jonson, their unequal company of wits, make merry at the Mermaid Tavern, there is already growing up on the same London street a poet who shall bring a new force into literature, who shall add to the Renaissance culture and love of beauty the tremendous moral earnestness of the Puritan. Such a poet must begin, as the Puritan always began, with his own soul to discipline and enlighten it before expressing its beauty in literature. He that would hope to write well hereafter in laudable things, says Milton, ought himself to be a true poem, that is, a composition and pattern of the best and most honorable things. Here is a new proposition in art which suggests the lofty ideal of Fra Angelico, that before one can write literature which is the expression of the ideal, he must first develop in himself the ideal man. Because Milton is human, he must know the best in humanity. Therefore, he studies, giving his days to music, art and literature, his nights to profound research and meditation. But because he knows that man is more than mortal, he also prays, depending, as he tells us, on devout prayer to that eternal Spirit who can enrich with all utterance and knowledge. Such a poet is already in spirit far beyond the Renaissance, though he lives in the autumn of its glory and associates with its literary masters. There is a spirit in man, says the old Hebrew poet, and The inspiration of the Almighty giveth him understanding. Here, in a word, is the secret of Milton's life and writing. Hence his long silences, years passing without a word, and when he speaks it is like the voice of a prophet who begins with a sublime announcement, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. Hence his style producing an impression of sublimity which has been marked by which has been marked for wonder by every historian of our literature. His style was unconsciously sublime because he lived and thought consciously in a sublime atmosphere. Life of Milton. Milton is like an ideal in the soul, like a lofty mountain on the horizon. He never attained the ideal, he never climbed the mountain, but life would be inexpressibly poorer were either to be taken away. From childhood, Milton's parents set him apart for the attainment of noble ends and so left nothing to chance in the matter of training. His father, John Milton, is said to have turned Puritan while a student at Oxford and to have been disinherited by his family, whereupon he settled in London and prospered greatly as a scrivener, that is a kind of notary. In the character, the elder Milton was a rare combination of scholar and businessman, a radical Puritan in politics and religion, yet a musician whose hymns tunes are still sung and a lover of art and literature. The poet's mother was a woman of refinement and social grace, with a deep interest in religion and in local charities. So the boy grew up in home and which combined the culture of the Renaissance with the piety and moral strength of early Puritanism. He begins therefore as the heir of one great age and the prophet of another. Apparently the elder Milton shared Bacon's dislike for the educational methods of the time and so took charge of his son's training and praising his natural taste, teaching him music and seeking out a tutor who helped the boy to what he sought most eagerly, not the grammar and mechanism of Greek and Latin, but rather the stories, the ideals, the poetry that hide in their incomparable literature. At 12 years we find the boy already a scholar in spirit, unable to rest till after midnight because of the joy with which his study was rewarded. From boyhood to great principalship to dwell, Milton's career, one, the love of beauty, of music, art, literature, and indeed of every form of human culture. The other, a steadfast devotion to duty as the highest object in human life. A brief course at the famous St. Paul's School in London was the prelude to Milton's entrance to Christ's College, Cambridge. Here again, he followed his natural bent and, like Bacon, found himself often in opposition to the authorities. Aside from some Latin poems, the most noteworthy song of this period of Milton's life is his splendid ode on the morning of Christ's Nativity, which was begun on Christmas Day 1629. Milton, while deep in the classics, had yet a greater love for his native literature. Spenser was for years his master. In his works we find every evidence of his loving study of Shakespeare, and his last great poems show clearly how he had been impressed by Fletcher's Christ's victory and triumph. But it is significant that this first ode rises higher than anything of the kind produced in the famous age of Elizabeth. While at Cambridge, it was the desire of his parents that Milton should take orders in the Church of England, but the intense love of mental liberty which stampeded the Puritan was too strong within him, and he refused to consider the oath of servitude, as he called it, which would mark his ordination throughout his life. Milton, though profoundly religious, held aloof from the strife of sects. In belief, he belonged to the extreme Puritans called separatists, independents, congregationalists, of which our pilgrim fathers are the great example. But he refused to be bound by any creed or church discipline, as ever in my great taskmaster's eye. In this last line of one of its sonnets is found Milton's rejection of every form of outward religious authority in face of the supreme Puritan principle, the liberty of the individual soul before God. A long period of retirement followed Milton's withdrawal from the university in 1632. At his father's country home in Horton, he gave himself up for 6 years to solitary reading and study, roaming over the wide field of Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Spanish, French, Italian, and English literatures, and studying hard at mathematics, science, theology, and music, a curious combination. To his love of music, we owe the melody of all his poetry, and we note it in the rhythm and balance which make even his mighty prose arguments harmonious. In Lycidas, El Allegro, second, Penseroso, Arcades, Comus, and a few sonnets, we have the poetic results of this retirement. At Horton, few indeed, but the most perfect of their kind that our literature has recorded. Out of solitude, where his talent was perfected, Milton entered the busy world where his character was to be proved to the utmost. From Horton he travelled abroad through France, Switzerland, and Italy, everywhere received with admiration for his learning and courtesy, winning the friendship of the exiled Dutch scholar Grotius in Paris, and of Galileo in his sad imprisonment in Florence. He was on his way to Greece when news reached him of the break between king and parliament. With the practical insight which never deserted him, Milton saw clearly the meaning of the news. Its cordial reception in Italy, so chary of praise to anything not Italian, had reawakened in Milton the old desire to write an epic which England would not willingly let it die, but at thought of the conflict or human freedom, all his dreams were flung to the winds. He gave up his travels and literary ambitions and hurried to England. For I thought it base, he says, to be travelling at my ease for intellectual culture, while my fellow countrymen at home were fighting for liberty. Then for nearly 20 years, the poet of great achievement and still greater promise disappears. We hear no more songs, but only the prose, denunciations and arguments which are as remarkable as his poetry in all of our In all our literature, there is nothing more worthy of the Puritan spirit than this laying aside of personal ambitions in order to join in the struggle for human liberty. In his best known sonnet on his blindness, which reflects his grief not at darkness but at his abandoned dreams, we catch the sublime spirit of this renunciation. Milton's opportunity to serve came in the crisis of 1649. The king had been sent to the scaffold, paying the penalty of his own treachery, and England sat shivering at his own deed, like a child or a Russian peasant who, in sudden passion, resists unbearable brutality and then is afraid of the consequences. 2 weeks of anxiety, of terror and silence followed, then appealed Milton's tenor of kings and magistrates to England. It was like the coming of a strong man, not only to protect the child but to justify his blow for liberty. Kings, no less than people, are subject to the eternal principle of law, the divine right of a people to defend and protect themselves. That was the mighty argument which calmed the people's dread and proclaimed that a new man and a new principle had arrived in England. Britain was called to be secretary for foreign tanguis in the new government, and for the next few years until the end of the Commonwealth, there were two leaders in England: Cromwell, the man of action; Milton, the man of thought. It is doubtful to which of the two humanity owes most for its emancipation from the tyranny of kings and prelates. Two things of personal interest deserve mention in this period of Milton's life: his marriage and his blindness. In 1643, he married Mary Cowell, a shallow, pleasure-living girl, the daughter of a royalist, and that was the beginning of sorrows. After a month tiring of the austere life of a Puritan household, she abandoned her husband, who, with the same radical reasoning with his, he dealt with the affairs of state, promptly repudiated the marriage. His doctrine and discipline of divorce and his Petra Gordon are the arguments to justify his position, but they accused a storm of protest in England, and they suggest to a modern reader that Milton was perhaps as much as to blame as his wife, and that he had scant understanding of a woman's nature when his wife, fearing for her position, appeared before him in tears. All his ponderous arguments were swept aside by a generous impulse, and though the marriage was never a happy one, Milton never again mentioned his wife's desertion. The scene in Paradise Lost, where Eve came weeping to Adam, seeking peace and pardon, is probably a reflection of a scene in Milton's own household. His wife died in 1653, and a few years later he married another, whom we remember for the sonnet, "Methought I saw my late espoused saint," in which she is celebrated. She died after 15 months, and in 1663 he married a third wife, who helped the blind old man to manage his poor household. Dear friends, all of you are listening English literature, language and grammar. Thanks all of you, those who are preparing NET and SLAT examination of English literature.